After the guilt, it was time to decide who was to blame. Although Mom said it was her fault, we all took different paths to get to our final destination. Randy and Tim eventually shifted most of the blame to Dad. His inability to forgive made him the bad guy. I could see how angry they were at their father. Michael was the complete opposite. He took his mother's confession to heart. He accepted the blame and began to take it out on himself. Michael's relationship with his mother deteriorated. He became even more rebellious against her. Many times I had to intercede to keep the peace. My own path led me parallel to Tim and Randy. I knew what Mom did was wrong, but Dad had to bear some of the blame. With each passing year, Dad's responsibility grew. I could feel my anger at my father growing. When I turned 19, I looked for my father about every 3 months. One day I asked my mom if she had ever looked for him and she cried. She stated that she never found him. I think she had looked for it but never found anything. I looked for it on the internet. Every chance I got, Google is a wonderful thing. I found copies of his diploma and several articles in aviation engineering magazines that mentioned his name. However, I never found anything new. Just after the summer, good fortune caught up with me. I discovered the results of the San Diego half marathon. There I found a list with my father's name, his age, and the city of residence of La Jolla. I remembered that Dad had participated in several 10K races when we were growing up, so I looked deeper. The photo of the race showed the start, finish, and various shots of the crowd in the background. I discerned someone who looked like him. Bingo before dark. I made it to St. George. My family was at a crossroads, and now I had the key to either destroy the rest of the journey or try to heal it. How would my brothers take the news of what Mom had done? We were all shifting the blame to him. My brothers kept asking why he couldn't forgive her. What was so bad? What about us? Now that I had the answers to these questions, I realized the effect this information would have with the anger and hatred transferred to my mom. She was barely on her feet as it was. If her sons rebelled, it would throw her off balance. I was in a quandary. However, as the eldest, it was up to me to carry the burden. I found a small chain hotel near St. George and got there before 6. The hotel had a diner and I had a quick bite of a hamburger. By 9 I was in bed. But I don't think I fell asleep until 1 o'clock in the morning. Day 2 of my journey home began at 7 the next morning. I filled the gas tank and drove north on Highway 15. Throughout the miles, I remembered the pain. In my father's words, I understood that pain. I had my own experience with infidelity. I began to remember how my experiences echoed my father's, and the restaurant where I worked always had a lot of young guys as waiters and waitresses. The turnover rate was very high, and I lasted the longest. About 8 months ago, they hired a new girl. She was very pretty, killer build with a simmering personality. She lit up the room when she walked in. For some reason, she gravitated towards me. Her name was Vanessa Brown. I was working full-time and going to school. At the same time, my time was divided between family work and school. One day, after a long lunch shift at a restaurant, Vanessa came up to me. We talked about stupid customers, how bad the cooks were, and figured out how much in tips we'd get for the evening. Out of the blue, my mouth started talking. I asked her if she wanted to grab coffee after we were done. By the time my brain caught up with my mouth, it was too late. I started to blush and stutter. To my surprise, she said yes. She said she would love to have a cup of coffee with me after work. I drove us to Starbucks and bought coffee. I ordered a medium coffee and she ordered a double vanilla latte. $8 later, we had our coffees and sat down at a table to talk. The conversation flowed at its own pace. I was amazed that this pretty girl wanted to spend time with me. As we talked, I looked at my watch and noted that we had been sitting there for 2 hours. I had school tomorrow and she had an early shift. I drove her back to the restaurant to pick up my car. Before she jumped out of my car, she leaned over and kissed me on the cheek. That was fun for me. "Let's do it again," she said. And so it began. We had coffee at Starbucks several times a week. After 3 weeks, she said, "This Friday is my day off. I think you have one too." I was probably a little dumb but not completely stupid. I saw this as a chance and asked her out. "Hey, do you want to go out with me on Friday?" I asked. She smiled and said she'd love to. Thus began my relationship with Vanessa Brown. We went to Starbucks a couple times a week and a couple more times on dates. After another 3 weeks, Vanessa mentioned that her roommate was away for the weekend and invited me over. We continued dating for about 4 months. I think I had fallen in love with Vanessa. On our 5th anniversary of dating, I gave Vanessa a promise ring. She jumped into my arms and stuck her tongue down my throat so deep, I almost choked. I was so happy we had been dating for about 8 months. When I was called to work a double shift, one of the other waitresses had an emergency, and the manager asked if I could fill in for her. I called Vanessa and told her I wouldn't be able to meet her, and she didn't mind. I had 2 hours left on my shift when another girl came rushing into work. The emergency was taken care of, and she asked if she could work the rest of her shift. She really needed the money. I said yes and changed my clothes. I figured I could get to Vanessa's apartment, and maybe we could still go out. Vanessa lived in a garden-style apartment on the 2nd floor. I walked up the steps to her apartment and past the picture window. Peeking through the gap between the curtains, I saw my Vanessa making out with Peter Joyner. Peter was the morning manager at our restaurant. I was crushed. I knocked on Vanessa's door. She opened the door and gasped as she recognized me. She was flustered and started mumbling something about not expecting to see me. After calming down, I said I realized I had to work, but I had the day off. I also understand that you have made alternative arrangements. I will not force you to change your plans. I will, however, ask you to return the ring to me. I will not allow you to use the hand that my ring adorns to jerk off Peter Joyner. I took her hand and removed the ring. It was nice meeting you and goodbye. If we happen to pass by, please pretend you don't know me, and I'll do the same. I made my way home and climbed into my bed alone. The next morning, I headed to San Diego to continue my search for my father. Thinking back on that decision now, I think that perhaps I was just like my father, running away instead of facing betrayal head-on. I arrived home from San Diego around 6 o'clock, just in time for dinner. Mom called everyone over and we sat down at the table. Conversations flowed, questions were asked. Tim asked about my vacation in San Diego. I lied and told him about the zoo and SeaWorld. I mentioned the schools there and that they would be great for Randy and Tim. I looked at Michael. He looked stoned to me. I looked at Randy, but he just shrugged. I don't think Mom saw this conversation. Mom asked about Vanessa. I told her what happened. When I got to the point where I told her about my ring, she broke down and ran out from the table. Good for you, dude. Tim said. They continued their banter. I looked around the table and wondered again. What I should say, what could I say? How could a son destroy his mother? I felt I could hang Vanessa from the tallest lamppost, but could I do the same to Mom? They'd both cheated and Mom's crime was worse. She had other people's kids. Now I know what it's like to walk around with an atomic bomb in your pocket. I decided to hold off and think about it. Meanwhile, life went on. Randy enrolled in the local junior college. He received several scholarship offers, but he didn't want to leave his brothers. Tim was in his last year of high school and was looking for a college to attend. An idea occurred to me the next day. After school, I approached Randy and Tim and suggested they look at San Diego State University. Randy could transfer there as a junior and Tim could transfer there as a freshman. They could live in the same dorm. Given Randy's grades and Tim's athletic accomplishments, I was sure they would be accepted. They thought about it for a while but hesitated. San Diego is a long way from Mom, Michael and me. I assured them that we would be fine. Tim came around and was all for the idea, but Randy wasn't convinced. Tim and I kept pushing for San Diego State. We printed out applications and maps of the school. However, all of our efforts only made Randy more reluctant. It all came to a decision on Friday afternoon. We were in Tim's room working on his application when Randy exploded. I can't understand why you insist on San Diego, he said. It's an exceptional school. You two will do well there and you'll have each other, I replied. But Randy was no fool. Couldn't we go to the University of Colorado that way? We won't be too far away from you guys. I try to keep my cool. No better to San Diego. That's stupid, shouted Randy. I think we should just go to Colorado. Tell me why we should go to San Diego. I knew the time had come because that's where Daddy is, whispered. I silenced. There was a look of utter shock on both of their faces. Daddy's in San Diego. Questions followed. How do you know? Have you talked to him? They both began a rash of questions. Where is he? Have you talked to him? Did you find him when you went to San Diego? Why did he leave? Can I talk to him? Tears appeared in their eyes. I tried to calm them down and answer some of their questions. I found some clues online. I traced them back to San Diego after my rift with Vanessa. I just got in my car and drove there. I found him and talked to him. He misses us. I've kept in touch with him ever since I asked him about you two going to San Diego, and he said he would help you out. I felt I should add a few caveats. Mom can't know about Dad. Their breakup was very painful for Daddy. What happened? Tim asked. I'll leave it to Dad to explain, I said. Randy jumped up. We have to go over there. We have to see it. Let's plan a trip to San Diego and a school field trip. Winter break will be in 3 weeks. We'll go then. Mom agreed with Randy and Tim's idea about San Diego, but I think she saw it as the next step toward breaking up her family. I tried to support her, and that helped a little. Another victim was Michael. I was convinced that with Randy and Tim gone, he wasn't going to make it. I was sure he had started doing more drugs. I kept an eye on his school work. His grades and attendances were dropping. The excitement in the house was contagious. Randy and Tim were planning a trip to school secretly. They were just as excited to see their dad. I could tell from our emails that Dad was excited too. We discussed what he would tell them, but he hadn't come to any decisions. Mom was worried about the boys and offered her support as well. Early Saturday morning, we packed Mom's car and hugged them. Be careful, boys, Mom said, and turned to go back into the house. Michael and I hugged them, and I said, be careful. The road ahead has a lot of unknowns. Bumps and blind curves. Drive slowly. They both understood what I meant with those words. They drove off every couple hours. They would call and check in to see how things were going from the calls. We tracked their progress by my calculations. They should have reached San Diego around midnight at 1230. They called to say they had arrived. They would check in and call late in the morning. Mom and I said goodnight to them. What I knew what Mom didn't know was that they would be spending this trip at Dad's house. I realized that the brothers were in for a long night. For the next 3 days, they sounded excited and happy. San Diego was a beautiful city, and the school was the best. They said they had met someone who could help them with their applications. I didn't get a chance to talk to them privately, so I didn't know what Dad told them. They were on their way home on Thursday, and on Friday they arrived at 5 o'clock. We all met them in the driveway. We could see the smiles on their faces before they even stopped the car. They both jumped out of the car and ran straight to me. I gasped from their embrace. After that, they walked over to Michael. Then to my mom, I noticed that her hug wasn't as strong. I think I understood what the conversation was about. Pizza was ordered, and we all gathered around the table to discuss the trip. San Diego was great, the weather was always great, and their applications were already in their systems. They were confident that financial aid and scholarships would be able to cover the costs. After the conversations died down, Mom retired to her room as usual. Michael had gone somewhere else as well. This allowed Randy, Tim and I to be alone. They greeted their father. He was so happy to see Randy and Tim, and the feeling was mutual. Randy talked about what his father had told him about the breakup. He told them everything on the way home. They decided to leave things as they were and not ruin Mom any more than she already had. They decided that they would move there as soon as school was out in June. In the months that followed, Randy and Tim prepared for the move. They finished the school year with good grades in Randy's case and an MVP award for Tim. In their excitement, they didn't notice Michael leaving or their mom leaving. I was sure Michael had moved on to harder drugs. I tried to intervene, but he lashed out at me. I talked to my mom about him. She was aware and tried to help a couple times herself. Michael's problems and Randy and Tim leaving were taking their toll on Mom too. She didn't look so good. It was as if she had lost weight, and her hair was very dull and lifeless. Just after Christmas, Michael disappeared for 3 days. When the police found him, he was high in a drug house. My mom and I got him into a rehab center close to home. He was required to stay there for 2 weeks in an attempt to get clean. He resisted the whole way. His anger at his mom manifested itself. During one of the family sessions, he let her off the hook. He blamed her for causing his father to leave. Mom was reduced to tears. Each of Michael's attacks splintered her even more. I tried to defend her and fend off some of the verbal attacks, but Michael continued. He blamed her for taking Tim and Randy away. He blamed her for everything. Mom bravely withstood the attacks and said, Michael, you're right. I do deserve all the blame I did. But ever since he left, I've been trying to redeem myself. Michael, you can blame me. You can hate me, but please don't hate yourself. You need to let go of your self-destruction and try to be a better person. Do it for yourself and your brothers. After that, the session was over for the day. I almost had to carry my mom to the car. She was so exhausted. By this time, the pain was permanently imprinted on her face. 2 days after Tim's last final exam, Randy and Tim packed their bags, and were ready to leave for San Diego. After saying goodbye, they hit the road. They arrived 2 days later and called to let them know everything was okay. They were moving into a small off-campus apartment and were very excited. I was sure they would be spending a lot of time at Daddy's house as well. They had 7 weeks to settle in and figure things out before the semester started. I planned to visit them in August. Mom was glad they were doing well. She never expressed any concern about them leaving. I think she was genuinely happy that they were growing up and becoming independent. I was looking forward to my trip to San Diego too. I couldn't wait to see Tim, Randy, and Dad. I took the first flight out in the morning and all three were in the terminal to greet me. It was a very joyous reunion. There were smiles all around over lunch, jokes and memories sprinkled in. It seemed like the last 5 years had been forgotten. It was just a father and his 3 sons having a great lunch together. I had planned to spend a week in San Diego, but on Thursday I got a call from my mom. Michael had overdosed. Could I come home immediately? Less than 3 hours later I was on a flight home. I didn't realize my dad was leaving 2 hours after me. When I arrived at the hospital, I went straight to the ICU. I found my mom sitting next to Michael's bed. She was holding his hand and crying when she saw me. She rushed over to hug me. "Robert." I tried to make him stop. "I tried," she cried. "I know." "Mom," I said, "we all tried. Go home and get some sleep. I'll stay here with Michael." She didn't want to, but I made her reluctantly. She left, but only after she agreed to release me. At first light, no more than 2 hours had passed. When my father entered the hospital room, I was stunned. I've been away too long. This is my fault. I must try to make things right. But how? "Dad," I began. "I thought about it on the flight home, and I think I've found a possible solution. We need to seek professional help from Michael, and I think we need to leave him with his brothers. Can we find a rehab facility in San Diego? You can help him deal with his anger, and Randy and Tim can help in other areas." We discussed the concept and worked out the details. Dad could get a company jet to fly Michael to the clinic in San Diego. They would work on addiction issues, and all 4 would attend family counseling. Hopefully away from Mom, Michael could begin to recover. Dad spent the night in the hospital room with Michael and me. He left before dawn. He still couldn't imagine seeing his wife. When Mom arrived, I explained to her the idea of rehab in San Diego. I talked about the pros and cons of staying with his brothers in the distance from us. Surprisingly, Mom agreed. She knew of Michael's anger toward her and thought the distance would help heal the scars. Michael's anger was weighing on Mom too. She looked even worse. I could have sworn she'd lost even more weight since I'd left for San Diego. Behind the scenes, Dad made all the arrangements. Monday morning, an ambulance took Michael to the airfield. He and the nurse would board a private plane that would take them to San Diego. There, another ambulance would meet them and take them to a rehabilitation center. Mom was unaware of how things would work out there. The doctors would decide when to reintroduce Michael to his father. I thought it was a good plan and hoped it would go well. It was Sunday evening when my mom and I had just gotten out of the hospital. We got home and found Aunt Shannon waiting. She already had coffee brewed and 3 mugs at the ready. We sat down at the table to talk about tomorrow and Michael's trip. Then Mom said to me, "Robert, you have to go with Michael. You have to be there for him. You've been a father figure to him for the last 5 years, and he still needs you." I looked at Shannon and saw agreement in her eyes. I was ambushed. I laid out all the reasons why I couldn't go, and she and Shannon dismissed them all. Mom explained that she could safely stay home alone. She said Shannon was there for her and would help her if she needed anything. She laid out the plan for me. I was to stay in San Diego, probably with Randy and Tim. I would have power of attorney for Michael's medical care, and I would do his rehab. We would stay there and do additional therapy for Michael when and if he got stronger. I was to decide if he should come home to Colorado. By Mom and Shannon's calculations, it could take up to 3 months for Michael to get healthy enough to make a decision. I didn't want to go, but they just threw me on a plane. In the morning, the private jet could hold 1 more passenger, so I settled in next to Michael. In the end, my presence helped Michael survive the trip. Mom had made the right choice. Michael entered the rehab center a little more willingly this time. This time he was going to be there for 27 days. Randy. Tim and I visited him often. I consulted with his doctors and we had face-to-face meetings. Michael was making progress. Being in San Diego with his brothers was helping him. The drugs were out of his system, and he was thinking more clearly. The second week we brought my dad in so he could talk to the doctors about Michael. Once a week we had family therapy sessions. All four brothers sat with a therapist to discuss some issues. It was during this meeting that we wanted to reintroduce Dad. The therapist started the conversation with questions about our dad. We let Michael lead the conversation. Michael talked about how much he missed his dad and how hard it was without him. Michael was crying. Randy, Tim and I had tears in our eyes as well. The therapist asked Michael if you could say anything to your father right now, what would you say? Michael didn't even hesitate. I would tell him that I miss him. I forgive him for leaving, but I want him back. I would ask him to forgive me, Mom and all of us. With those words, the door opened and our father walked into the room. Michael looked up and saw him. His face was blank, then recognition flashed across it, and then happiness. He jumped up and ran to him. Dad, he repeated soon after. Tim, Randy and I joined in a group hug. It was as if a switch had been flipped in. Michael gone was the sullen, angry drug-using man. In his place was a happy 16-year-old boy ready to face the world. Therapy continued for Michael and the whole family. I think we all solved some of our problems because of it. However, no one discussed the elephant in the room. What about Mom? I felt my dad still had issues with her, and I had no idea about her side of the story. How do we talk to her about it? Can we invite her to therapy to find out the reasons why? How do we tell her what we know and that we found Dad? I kept my mom updated on the progress. I told her about everything except the father and his interactions. She seemed happy. However, I also felt some sadness. I wondered if I should make a trip home to see how she was doing. Michael and I had been there for about 2 months. I was sure she would want to see me. I called her and told her I wanted to come home. She said it wasn't necessary. I insisted that I wanted to come home, and she was equally adamant that Michael needed me more than she did. I left it at that, but knew I was planning a trip in a couple weeks. The following week we were having dinner at Dad's house when my cell phone rang. I figured Mom was checking in to see how things were going. I didn't recognize the number, but it had an Aurora area code. I answered it. It was Aunt Shannon. Robert, your mom is dead. Part 3, Sandy's story. The cool mountain wind chilled me to the core. A small crowd stood by the grave to say the last words and lower the casket. The grave was in a small alcove among the trees. It had a view of the distant mountains. Mom would have loved it. Tim, Randy, Michael and I stood in a row. Each of us grieving. The sadness lay like a dark blanket on the cold Colorado cemetery. Only one of Mom's brothers was able to attend the service. He stood beside us and expressed his support. Dad attended the service but remained on the sidelines. After the funeral service, my brothers and I accepted condolences from Mom's coworkers and the few remaining friends. Mom didn't have many friends. The few friends that were left remained loyal to her even through the last 5 years, since my dad left. Mom hadn't made any new friends as the oldest son. I was tasked with organizing the service and coordinating the funeral, but almost all of the arrangements were made by Mom. She left detailed instructions for us to follow. Aunt Shannon was the last to leave the service. She walked up to my brothers and expressed her condolences. She hugged each of us. She hugged me tightly. Tears were running down her cheeks as well. Robert may have gotten a little bored with me, but soon he started taking his friend Randy with him. Not long after that, I got pregnant again. I used the pregnancy to stay away from Robert, but it didn't work out. In the 9th month, he came to our house and took me into your father's bed. He told me to name the baby Randy after his buddy. I had to do it, or he would be back the day after the baby was born. I agreed again. Randy was born and your father never suspected a thing. I was tearing up inside. How could he not realize what Robert had done to me? Many years later, I realized why I lost respect for your father. I went back to work a few months after Randy was born and learned that Robert had been transferred to the East Coast. I was thrilled. I was free. But his impact was profound through his actions. My husband was no longer my protector. Your father never came to my aid. It never occurred to me that my thoughts were completely irrational. In spite of all this, I became the mother I wanted to be. I had 2 sons and I tried to be everything to them. I tried to bring some work into the process, but I felt like I was failing. I disrespected my husband and felt he was more concerned about his career than me. I started feeling depressed and lonely again. A coworker named Susan came to my rescue. She convinced me to go out and have some fun. For a while, Susan had a close group of friends. Unfortunately, I didn't realize how close until they lured me into their web. Soon Susan and I started meeting every week and having parties, usually at the end of the night. Susan would hook up with one of her friends, and soon I did too. I don't even remember their names. A couple months later, I got pregnant again. With the pregnancy, the partying stopped quickly. Tim was born 9 months later. At the time, I still thought your father was responsible for the three of you. You all looked like him, dark hair and easy smiles. Your father wanted to name him after his father, but by then I had lost respect for him and wouldn't oblige. I took the name Timothy from the last James Bond actor I had any sympathy for. After Tim's birth, I went back to partying. Susan and her friends wouldn't let me be alone. A few months later, I got pregnant again. Your father was over the moon. He had 3 sons and he was hoping for a daughter. I didn't care. When my 4th son was born, I realized I was in trouble. I knew right away that Michael was not your father's son. He looked different, acted different, and grew up with different skills. I prayed and hoped no one would ever find out. With Michael's arrival, your father and I decided that I should get my tubes tied. He was happy with 4 sons and I was terrified that Michael might not be his. We continued to live for a few more years after Michael was born. I didn't go back to work for the insurance company. I stayed home and took care of you boys. I became the mother I wanted to be by then. I had lost respect for your father. He never found out about my affairs, and in my mind that meant he cared. It meant he wasn't worthy of my love or yours. I want to make one thing clear. I completely understood his job. I searched his briefcase every night, and I was jealous. I eavesdropped on his dinner conversations, though he didn't realize it. I memorized everything he said. I knew more than he gave me credit for. I knew about the secret airplane design and other secret things. He was doing great things and I was stuck here. I was jealous. He was a great designer and helped prepare our country for the future. And I was an adulterer's. Robert, when you were about 5 years old, I started the cycle again. I started volunteering at several nonprofit organizations in our area. We would hold a few meetings and have a couple cocktails. Afterward, I started using these meetings to escape the loneliness. When I was alone, my insecurities grew around every corner. I could see Uncle Charlie coming back to get me. One evening, as I was walking back to my car, a man approached me. I instinctively turned around and swung my purse. I felt the fear recede as the purse collided with her face. But when I came to my senses, I saw a young girl lying in the parking lot. She was just walking to her car and I had broken her jaw. That incident shook me. It was then that I realized I needed help. One of the people in my organization referred me to a psychologist. My friend brought me to Dr. Shannon Mackenzie. Dr. Mackenzie began to explore my issues. We began working on Uncle Charlie and the problems associated with him. When we moved on to the last 5 years, Robert and my affairs depression set in. She helped me break free from Uncle Charlie and Robert's hold on me. I soon realized the damage I had done to our family. She forced me to focus on my husband and our sons. A few months later, Dr. Mackenzie became Shannon. Shannon brought me back from the edge. She helped me realize that my past behavior had almost destroyed our family. Shannon made me realize that I was placing blame on your father. She made me realize that even though I tried to block your relationship with him, he was there for you at every acting class, every recital, every graduation, even at his job. She made me recognize that I was trying to drive a wedge between my husband and his sons. She trapped me by using the same terms against me that I used against my husband. I soon realized that he was nothing more than a loving husband and father. My guilt and anger were wrongly directed at him. Shannon helped me to love the man again. Shannon turned into a true friend. She handled ethical issues and got advice from her coworkers so that we could allow this friendship to grow. She became such a mentor. Shannon saved my life on more than one occasion as a friend. Shannon often came to our house, sometimes to give me advice, other times to watch the family and the interactions almost undercover to see the natural love and affection of the family. Once she had this information, she would start new discussions and offer additional options for help. "Had none," she cried. When I shared that I had not thought about Michael being my husband's son, I hoped that this secret would never come out. Shannon kept trying to convince me to bring the past out in the open, but I couldn't. Your father was a man of principle. He didn't accept any psychiatric diagnoses. He believed that all people should be held accountable for their actions, and we couldn't blame our current actions on someone long gone. I knew how he would react if he found out Michael wasn't his child. Turns out I was right. Somehow he had to find out the truth. The note he left behind said it all I know. "Robert, you remember those days right after you left? You were so strong. I've never been more proud of you than I was in those days. and every day since you became what I always hoped you would become the third day after he left. I called Shannon and she came right over. She got me out of bed and convinced me that our sons needed a mom. She forced me back into the world of the living. We started over as a single mom with 4 sons. We persevered and survived through all the trials and tests. We stuck together as a family. There's a lot of credit to you and your brothers for that, but your father also deserves credit. He passed on his knowledge and wisdom to his sons, and they have continued it and always made the right decisions. His guidance and support in absentia helped us all. I have tried to find him on numerous occasions. The first attempt I made was through all of our friends, family, and work. No one had seen him or heard from him. It was as if he had vanished off the face of the earth. I knew someone at his job had to know something. He was too important to just up and leave. A few months after your father left, I was contacted by the FBI. A special agent interviewed me. We sat down at a table and he questioned me for over an hour. I told him the reason was because I had cheated on my husband and he had found out. I tried to convince the FBI that your father was an honest and trustworthy man. I told him that your father would never do anything to betray trust with that. He left. A few months later I called his work again and inquired. They still didn't know anything but informed me that the FBI had found him in Atlanta. From then on I was sure the FBI was watching him. I asked several times but they never told me. 2 years later I hired a private investigator. We didn't have a lot of money, but he did some comprehensive searches. He didn't find anything. We moved on with our lives. You supported us as best you could, and your brothers continued their studies. I know the sacrifices you made. I know you had to go to college. I know you found a job to support your family for that. I am forever grateful. A month after you left for San Diego on your journey, the following truth was revealed to me. I understand the reason for your trip. Vanessa Brown was not the girl for you. She was a horror. I saw that and hoped that when you learned the truth, you wouldn't be too devastated. When you came back from San Diego, you were different. You were different. You were more confident, more knowledgeable, and more helpful to your brothers and me. Before your trip, I felt a little different. The food stopped tasting good. I had cramps and my weight was dropping. It was during your trip to San Diego that I went to the doctor. After several tests, it turned out I had cancer. Apparently. It had originated in my ovaries. By the time we discovered it, the cancer had already spread. The prognosis was unfavorable. I could have delayed the inevitable, but it would have come too soon anyway. That's when I made my second discovery. Rummaging through your father's desk for insurance documents, I found DNA tests. I, like your father, discovered the true depth of my betrayal. I was devastated. Now I know why your father never came back. If the roles had been reversed, I would have done the same. That information sealed my fate. I wanted to end my life early, but Shannon convinced me to take action. From that point on, I did everything I could to make sure you and your brothers were provided for and could live after me. I pushed Tim and Randy to enroll at San Diego State University. Then, I pushed Michael to go there to be with them. I knew you would be forced to stay with them. Robert. I did it for several reasons. I didn't want you to sit by and watch me die. I had done too much to destroy this family, to let my death be another morbid event, and I didn't want to be glorified as the hero of this story. You all need to live your lives away from me and live the way your father wanted you to. When Tim and Randy were accepted, I was happy Michael's relapse gave me the opportunity to take him in with his brothers. I knew you would be forced to support Michael. I hated to use you in that way, but I figured it was for the best, Robert. As I lie here on my deathbed, I look back on all the good things life has brought me. You, Randy. Tim and Michael are a blessing to the world. You should cherish them. I know Michael has some issues, but maybe this truth will set him free. I know the end is near. There is one more piece of information I want to share with you. Last year, one of my friends told me that she thought she saw your father in San Diego. Robert. You have to find him. The realization that you boys can meet and talk to your father has lifted my spirits. I know that illness will take me sooner rather than later. Realizing that your father can support you will allow me to die in peace. You must tell him my story. I know he will never forgive me, but he must forgive himself. He has to help rebuild what I destroyed. I never divorced him and he is responsible for Michael. He will take care of Michael, no matter who the father is. An FBI special agent can help call him. As the days grow shorter and the pain intensifies, I realize that the blame for this tragic comedy lies with me. As I lie here alone and dying, I realize that this is the only right path for me, loneliness. I loved one man and destroyed him. We built a family on lies and deceit. When that deception came to light, as it always does, our family crumbled like a house of cards. The only thing that kept it from falling apart was your father's character. The love he instilled in you helped us through the toughest of times. Your father. "Robert, can I have a word with you?" she asked. She took my hand and pulled me aside. "Robert, your mother asked me to give you this. After she died, she held out 2 envelopes to me. She wouldn't let me tell anyone that she was sick. After you read the letter, call me please," she begged. Without looking back, I put the envelopes in my jacket pocket. Mom's death came as a complete surprise to me. I didn't know she had cancer. She kept it well hidden from us. My brothers and I didn't even realize she was sick. In hindsight, I noted that she hadn't looked well the past few months. I put it down to stress and problems with Michael. I felt even worse. I should have noticed I don't remember much about the phone call from Aunt Shannon when she informed me that Mom had died. I must have gone very pale. Dad and my brothers noticed this and stopped their dinner conversation. After hanging up the phone, I turned to them and said, "Mom's dead." It was Aunt Shannon. She had cancer. Everyone was shocked. Michael started to deny that can't be. She can't be gone. Tears ran down his cheeks. His father rushed to him and hugged him tightly. Soon, Randy and Tim joined them and I followed. All of us were openly crying. After a few minutes, we dispersed. The remnants of dinner were left on the table. We all went out onto my father's terrace and sat in silence. Millions of questions arose in each of our minds. Finally, one question went out. "Dad, what do we do now?" I asked. We all turned to our father for guidance on what to do. "We all need to go back to Colorado," he stated emphatically with those words. He sat down at the phone and booked a company plane for our return home. 3 hours later, we were in the air. We landed in Denver and Dad rented a car to take us home. We pulled into the driveway around 1 o'clock in the morning when we pulled up to the house. Aunt Shannon came out of the house to greet us. After hugs, condolences, and brief explanations, we tried to get some sleep. We all went to our rooms. Dad left to get a hotel room. We tried to convince him to stay with us at the house, but he said he couldn't anyway. The next few days were busy sending out notices, answering calls from well-wishers, and making funeral preparations. After the service, we did not have a reception at the house. It was just Aunt Shannon, Dad, and us. Aunt Shannon looked at Dad cautiously and Dad wondered about her. Aunt Shannon became an occasional guest in the house about 5 years before Dad left. When Dad left, she started coming to the house more often. She was a good friend of Mom's. Shannon cooked a small dinner for us, and we sat mostly in silence. After dinner, we cleaned up and moved into the living room. Conversation was very sparse, each of us busy with our own thoughts. Shannon started the conversation by asking a few questions. At first they were addressed to me, but soon we all joined in the discussion. I noticed that Shannon was very skillful at asking questions. She asked an open-ended question about a good memory and encouraged us to open our hearts. Dad didn't participate much. Shannon would cast a pleading look at him and then move on to one of us. It went on like this for several hours. By the end of the evening, we were bereaved but had already begun the healing process. Shannon apologized. She said she needed to go home. She said she would be home for breakfast. Shortly afterward, my dad excused himself to go back to his hotel. I went up to my room, taking off my coat. I discovered the letters. They were standard 10 envelopes, plain white. I felt they were heavy. Each had several pages in it. Both had my name written on them in my mother's handwriting. On one letter she wrote, "Open me first." I sat on the bed, opened the letter and began to read. "Dear Robert, if you are reading this, it means I have succumbed to cancer. They say confession is good for the soul, but I know my soul will not receive salvation. I know where I will be in eternity, and I know I deserve it. I know that you and your brethren have had questions from the beginning. I know that those questions remain unanswered to this day. In this last confession, I will try to shed light on the answers. I will try not to sugarcoat anything. I am not asking for forgiveness. I am only asking for understanding. Over the years, I have avoided questions in an attempt to protect the innocent. I alone kept the knowledge of our family's destruction. Now, like so many other times in our lives, I pass that burden on to you, Robert. You have shouldered so many of our burdens. I can only hope that this latest assignment will relieve you of many problems. I will try not to be painful. Our life has been full and enjoyable, and I am grateful for that. Even in the last 5.5 years, our life has been good. Your father and you boys have filled me with happiness beyond what I deserved. The only thing that saddens me is that much of what we had was based on lies, and those lies can tarnish memories of the past, but it doesn't. Your memories of our lives are pure, and nothing I can tell you should change that. The fact that you fell off a pine tree in the backyard and landed on your hand is not tainted. Your father's comedic attempts to splint your arm and get you to the emergency room are not tainted. You will remember the events as they were not tainted by my confessions. Your brothers look to you as the guiding star of our family, and I hope that will continue to be the case. You have always been strong. Your courage helped your brothers, but more importantly, it helped me. Even when I knew my time was limited, you helped me move forward. Robert. My loving son Robert, please forgive me. You have been told many times about the first times your father and I met. I met your father on the first day of our freshman year, but my story must begin 2 years earlier. Robert. You should know that only one other person knows this story. I was afraid to tell this story, but now I know I have to do it. Most people think our story started when I moved to Colorado as a freshman, but it actually started earlier when we lived in Stillwater, Oklahoma. My parents and all 3 of us kids were born in Stillwater. I recall that my mom and dad were loving parents. Dad worked in the insurance office and Mom took care of me and my brothers. We had almost everything we needed. I remember growing up in Stillwater was a wonderful time. We expected to live there for the rest of our lives. It was a good life. My dad had a job in town that he liked, and my mom fed and clothed us kids. You met my 2 brothers a couple times. We had a big extended family in Oklahoma, and Mom and Dad had a lot of friends and relatives in the area. Dad had 2 brothers and 3 sisters. They all had lots of kids. Family parties and picnics were attended by many aunts, uncles, nieces, nephews, and cousins. Nearly 100 relatives from our extended family would gather at these parties. My father was closest to his brother Charlie. Uncle Charlie had 3 sons. Me, my brothers, and Uncle Charlie's children were as close as any other family. I thought of my cousins as brothers. Robert. You know what it's like growing up with brothers. Since I was the youngest, they put up with me and protected me. I grew up a tomboy. Uncle Charlie looked after me a lot, but he always treated me very badly. When I met your father at school, I was still afraid of boys. My parents took me to a therapist to help me get over the trauma, but I was still afraid. But your father was different. He never pushed me into anything I wasn't ready for. We learned and became friends. We complemented each other, so he had gaps in English that I could fill, and I had gaps in math that he filled. When I got older, I fell in love with him. He invited me to our homecoming, and I knew what was coming next. Doubts consumed me the entire week leading up to the event. I couldn't sleep. I hoped I could get through it. The night went well. I quelled my fears. He hadn't done anything I didn't want him to. I was sure he loved me. From that moment on, I knew I would marry this man. When your father was accepted to MIE, I came running home in tears. He was going to leave me. My parents calmed me down enough that I was able to explain what the problem was. I had become so attached to him, so dependent on him, that I couldn't be away from him. Both of your grandparents did their best to get me accepted to Boston College. It was in Boston that the seeds of my destruction began to germinate. Your father had to study long and hard. He spent hours in the library or with professors. I was alone. I developed fears and phobias. He wasn't always there to protect me. It became unbearable for me to be alone. I started to need other people. I had school friends who could always keep me company. It was a mixed group, and they liked to party and drink. No one could afford drugs, so cheap beer was our favorite drink. One night, when everyone was packing up to leave, I got scared. I didn't want to be alone. I flirted with a few guys to keep them from leaving. The flirting led nowhere, but I never told your father about it later. That flirting led me to where we are now. After we got our degrees and moved back home, our lives stabilized with my friends and family from Colorado. My fears were quelled. Our wedding was everything I could have ever hoped for. I was so in love. We settled well into married life. Your father got his dream job. I worked for an insurance company. The job wasn't hard and didn't require a college degree, but it didn't matter. We were happy and the money was good. But my demons weren't far from the surface, and after just a few months they came out first. Your father's job started taking up all of his time. I was alone again. The old fears returned. I turned to work, friends to occupy my time, and not be alone. We started stopping by after work for a couple drinks. Once again, it was a mixed bunch of men and women. One of them was named Robert. He worked in the reinsurance department. In retrospect, I can say that Robert was a lot like your father. Unfortunately, he was also a lot like Uncle Charlie, and not just in looks. One evening everyone had to go home. The weather was not good and everyone wanted to get home before the storm started. Maybe it was my fears and insecurities or too much alcohol. But I was flirting with Robert. He flirted back. We said he lived only a couple miles from me and I decided to follow him home. Instead of leading me to my house, he led me straight to his house. He offered me a drink, and for some reason I accepted. That drink was followed by another, which led to us having fun on the couch in his living room. I left quickly after that, came home showered and had time to cry and fall asleep before your father arrived. The next day at work, Robert came to my desk. I tried to tell him that last night was a mistake, but he pushed me away and took me into the closet. "We can't talk in there," he said. "People will hear us." He closed and locked the door. "So what's the mistake?" He walked toward me. I resisted, but he took a more forceful approach. All my fears came back. From then on, Robert used me whenever he wanted. I was powerless to stop him. I couldn't tell your father because of the guilt I felt for destroying my father's family. It went on like that for months when I got pregnant. I was happy. I wanted children with your father so badly and hoped Robert would leave me alone. It worked. Robert only called me a couple times during the entire pregnancy. Right before you went into labor, he called me. I was powerless to stop him. He was upset that I was having a baby with my husband and demanded that I name you Robert. I cried and agreed. Your father and I tried to conceive a child, and I was sure we succeeded. It was only much later that I learned the truth. When you were born, you looked just like your father. We were so happy. I stayed home for a couple months to care for you, and now my life is whole. I'll never be alone again. You will always protect me, even as a baby. You were my savior, amen. When I returned to work, Robert was already waiting for me. He picked up where he left off and called me about once a month. And I use that term with all due respect as not to blame for this mess. I know he is your father, regardless of what the DNA test shows. He was there for you when it mattered. He's a good man. Find him. He'll apologize to you. He'll try to take responsibility, be his son, accept the man's minor flaws and become a family again. Robert. The cancer is close. I can feel it consuming me, but I don't want to dull the pain with morphine. I know you want to come home to see me, but I can't let that happen. That's the way it has to be. I should be alone, and you should be in the arms of your family. As I die, I see you and your brothers living with your father every day. I lie in bed hoping you will find him. If you find him, tell him I am so sorry and that I loved him. Do this for me in memory of me, your loving mom, Sandy. The second letter is for your father. I have given him my confession, as I told you before. If you ever find him, please give him the second letter. Robert folded the soiled letter and put it back in the envelope in his hands. He held the second letter to his father from the loss he had experienced and from his new knowledge. Robert cried that night and fell asleep the next morning. All the brothers and their father shared the letters Robert called. And soon Shannon arrived. Shannon began by reminiscing about the troubled woman and her road to recovery. She then turned her attention to healing this family anew. Shannon knew this family would survive. Love and forgiveness were evident, and her work would be short-lived. She knew these men would all support each other and thrive. The father and sons would be happy when Tim and Randy enrolled at San Diego State University and Michael was living with them. Robert and his father arranged to sell their mother's house. After a week in Colorado, Tim, Randy, Michael, and their father boarded the company plane and flew home. Robert stayed behind to finalize the sale of the house. Most of the furniture was given to Goodwill, and only their personal belongings were packed up and shipped to San Diego Nut. Robert took one last look at the house he had grown up in. He remembered all the good times. The bad times didn't come to mind. He locked the door one last time, got in his car, and headed west to his family. Epilogue. It had been 5 years since their mother had died. During that time, the boys and their father had prospered. Tim and Randy graduated from high school and got good jobs in the area. Robert had re-enrolled in school and was studying for his master's degree. Michael had put his past troubles behind him under his father's guidance. Michael excelled in school and was going to attend the University of California, San Diego. Another aspect of Michael's development was his music. Michael played guitar in a semi-successful band. They played gigs almost every weekend in the Gaslamp district, and their father started seeing a therapist that Shannon recommended he and Margot are working through. Last issues. There is hope for all of us. The end. If you haven't watched the first part of this video, the link will be in the description. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, so subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.